Welcome back to Rapture Tales. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and get ready for another story you won't forget. Let's dive back to the story. Lady Arabella Ashcroft had always believed that structures revealed the souls of those who built them. While other students at the Bartlett School of Architecture chased prestige projects that promised fame, Arabella designed spaces meant to hold human vulnerability, rehabilitation centers filled with light, children's hospitals shaped to reduce fear, libraries where silence felt protective rather than lonely. She was not born into indifference. Her widowed mother, Penelope Ashcroft Blythe, had raised her on poetry and resilience inside a quiet Surrey townhouse lined with books and climbing ivy. Penelope often told her that true legacy was not measured in inheritance but in impact, a philosophy Arabella carried like an internal compass. By 29, Arabella had become one of London's most promising young architects, known for marrying emotional intelligence with technical brilliance. At a nationally televised urban redevelopment summit held inside a sweeping glass auditorium overlooking the Thames, Arabella presented a design for a pediatric recovery campus, curved corridors to eliminate the harsh geometry that frightened children, rooftop gardens visible from every ward, and natural daylight engineered to follow circadian rhythms for faster healing. The audience, filled with developers, ministers, and private investors, fell into an unusual silence as she spoke. It was the silence of people realizing they were witnessing uncommon vision. Among them sat Sebastian Ashcroft, heir to an expanding private equity empire and already whispered about in financial circles as a man whose instincts bordered on prophetic. He did not applaud immediately when she finished. Instead, he studied her with an intensity that had nothing to do with architecture. To Sebastian, everything in life fell into two categories: assets or obstacles. Yet Arabella did not seem to fit either. She was not dazzled by the powerful men waiting to speak with her afterward, nor did she soften her opinions to attract funding. When Sebastian finally introduced himself during the reception that followed, he expected the usual flicker of recognition at his surname. It never came. Arabella asked him, quite plainly, whether his firm funded projects that benefited communities or merely those that multiplied capital. No one spoke to him like that. Something unfamiliar stirred, not affection, not yet, but a sharpened curiosity, like a strategist encountering an unsolved equation. Sebastian's interest matured into pursuit with the patience of someone accustomed to long games. Rather than overwhelming Arabella with extravagant gestures, he constructed access points into her world. Invitations to private exhibitions on restorative design, quiet dinners where conversation mattered more than spectacle, and handwritten notes referencing ideas she had mentioned only once. He listened with unnerving precision. Arabella found herself disarmed by a man who seemed less interested in dominating a room than understanding it. Their early dates unfolded across rain-polished London streets, hushed museums after hours, and river walks where the city lights trembled on black water. Yet beneath Sebastian's attentiveness existed a habit few recognized. He mirrored people expertly, adjusting tone and temperament until they felt profoundly seen. Only his younger brother Julian appeared resistant to the charm. Julian, warmer and less armored by ambition, watched their growing attachment with a thoughtful unease he could not fully articulate. He admires her, friends said. Julian was not so certain. Admiration suggested equality, while Sebastian's gaze often resembled evaluation. Arabella, meanwhile, experienced something she had rarely allowed herself: the sensation of emotional shelter. She had built her life through discipline, not dependence, but Sebastian's steadiness suggested partnership rather than possession. Within a year, their relationship became a quiet fascination in refined circles, the visionary architect and the analytical financier, intellect paired with influence. When Sebastian proposed during a winter weekend in the Cotswolds, there was no theatrical flourish, only a question spoken beside a frost-laced garden at dawn. Arabella said yes without hesitation, believing she had found someone who respected both her mind and her independence. Their wedding the following spring reflected that shared restraint, held at a centuries-old Hampshire estate, attended by diplomats, scholars, and industry leaders, yet absent of ostentation. Arabella refused sponsorship offers and magazine exclusives. She wanted the day preserved as memory, not performance. Observers called them the future of modern aristocracy, progressive yet rooted, powerful yet thoughtful. For a time, the description seemed accurate. Marriage unfolded with elegant momentum. Arabella's firm expanded rapidly after she completed the pediatric campus, drawing international commissions that allowed her to champion humane design on a broader scale. Sebastian's investment group, Ashcroft Capital, entered a period of aggressive growth, acquiring distressed companies and restructuring them with clinical efficiency. Evenings at their London residence often turned into spirited debates about ethics and economics. Arabella argued that profit without social consideration eroded the future. Sebastian countered that capital created the very opportunities reform required. Their disagreements felt invigorating rather than divisive, evidence, Arabella believed, of intellectual parity. When they relocated to Ashcroft Hall, the ancestral estate set amid rolling countryside and ancient oaks, she imagined it as a place where future children would run through sunlit corridors. Thomas Hale, the estate's long-serving groundskeeper, noticed subtleties invisible to guests. How Arabella paused to ask about his arthritic knee while Sebastian walked past already mid-conversation on a call. How she lingered outdoors absorbing quiet while he seemed most alive in negotiation. Still, nothing suggested fracture, not yet. The shift began the autumn Sebastian hired Camille Harrington as a strategic consultant. Camille arrived with understated elegance, her reputation preceding her as a deal-maker capable of untangling failing enterprises. She possessed a composure that bordered on hypnotic and spoke about markets with the clarity of someone who understood power as a language. Sebastian recognized in her a mind that moved as swiftly as his own. Their collaboration intensified through late-night analyses and cross-continental calls, victories accumulating until her presence within the firm felt indispensable. Arabella welcomed Camille warmly at first, grateful that someone seemed able to shoulder the escalating demands on her husband's time. Yet as months passed, Sebastian's assurances that the long hours were temporary grew thinner. When Arabella received a prestigious humanitarian design award and scanned the audience for him, his seat remained empty. An urgent meeting, his message read. She accepted the honor with professional grace, but a faint hollowness settled beneath her composure. Dr. Lillian Price, her closest friend and a trauma physician intimately familiar with concealed suffering, detected it immediately. "You look celebrated," Lillian told her afterward, "but not accompanied." Arabella dismissed the remark, unwilling to dramatize what might simply be the cost of two demanding careers. Winter deepened, and with it an unspoken distance. Arabella began voicing a desire she had postponed for years. She wanted a child, not someday but soon. Sebastian responded with careful logic about timing, expansions, market volatility. Each argument sounded reasonable, yet together they formed a pattern of perpetual deferral. Work, increasingly, became both his explanation and his refuge. Meanwhile, Camille's influence widened beyond the office. She anticipated Sebastian's decisions before he articulated them, challenged him without deference, and celebrated victories with a private intensity that excluded the rest of the firm. Their partnership developed a charged rhythm, initially intellectual, then threaded with something less definable yet more dangerous. Julian, visiting Ashcroft Hall for a weekend shoot, sensed the altered atmosphere immediately. Conversations truncating when Camille entered, Sebastian's rare laughter surfacing most freely in her presence. He said nothing, though unease lodged firmly within him. Arabella, too perceptive to ignore shifts yet too trusting to leap toward suspicion, told herself marriages evolved. Still, instinct has a language that bypasses denial. One evening, standing alone inside the children's hospice she had designed, sunlight dissolving into amber across curved walls, Arabella realized that while she was building sanctuaries for strangers, her own emotional home had grown strangely quiet. She resolved not to surrender it to silence. What she did not know was that elsewhere, in a private dining room far from watchful colleagues, Sebastian and Camille were discovering how seamlessly ambition could blur into intimacy. By the time the first undeniable lie took shape, a missed ceremony, a fabricated meeting, the fault lines beneath the Ashcroft marriage had already begun their slow, irreversible spread. Not yet. What you've read so far covers roughly the early arc of chapters 1-3 in full story form. We are still building the emotional and psychological foundation before the major betrayals intensify. Now I will continue the story seamlessly toward chapters 4-10 territory without labeling chapters, exactly as you instructed, no stops, no headings, no repetition, and maintaining strong suspense. Ashcroft Hall carried a quiet authority that photographs could never fully capture. The estate had stood for nearly 3 centuries, its stones softened by time, its long windows reflecting acres of disciplined gardens that seemed less planted than composed. Arabella had resisted moving there at first. Ancestral homes often felt like museums to the past, and she preferred spaces alive with reinvention. Yet over time she transformed portions of the residence with subtle modern warmth, reading alcoves flooded with daylight, softened interiors, a studio overlooking the eastern lawns where mist lifted each morning like a curtain. Staff quickly developed a protective affection for her, not out of obligation but because she remembered details: birthdays, family illnesses, ambitions whispered in passing. Thomas Hale, who had served 2 Ashcroft generations, remarked privately that the house sounded different when she walked through it, as though old timber approved of her presence. Sebastian, however, seemed only partially anchored to the estate. Even when physically present, his attention was elsewhere, on acquisitions, projections, negotiations unfolding across time zones. Arabella admired his discipline but began noticing how rarely his mind rested. Still, their evenings retained fragments of intimacy: shared wine beside the library fire, debates about infrastructure policy, laughter when Penelope visited, and gently mocked the absurdities of high finance. To any observer, they remained a formidable partnership. The true disruption arrived without ceremony. Camille Harrington did not enter rooms seeking attention. Attention reorganized itself around her. She possessed the composure of someone who had long ago learned that restraint unsettled people more effectively than display. Raised in Bath by academically rigorous parents, a statistician mother and a barrister father, Camille grew up fluent in analytical thinking and emotional self-containment. Achievement was expected, not praised. She studied economics at Cambridge, distinguished herself inside competitive consulting circles, and cultivated a reputation for rescuing failing ventures others considered unsalvageable. Yet beneath her professional steel existed a private hunger. Camille had spent her life adjacent to power, advising it, refining it, elevating it, but never owning it. Sebastian recognized in her something rare, not merely intelligence, but alignment. She challenged his assumptions without posturing, completed strategic models before he requested them, and understood risk with an almost intuitive sharpness. Their first months working together produced a string of improbably successful restructurings that industry publications began calling the Harrington effect. Board members trusted her recommendations. Investors requested her presence in negotiations. Soon it became difficult to recall how the firm had functioned without her. Arabella welcomed Camille graciously during their early encounters, even expressing relief that Sebastian finally had someone capable of matching his pace. During a dinner at Ashcroft Hall, Camille spoke thoughtfully about sustainable development, and Arabella found herself engaged rather than guarded. If there was tension, it remained invisible, the kind that forms beneath still water. But ambition has gravity. Late meetings stretched into later ones. Overseas calls blurred into midnight strategy sessions. Sebastian, who once protected small pockets of personal time with disciplined efficiency, now surrendered them without apparent awareness. When Arabella asked whether the expansion might be moving too aggressively, he reassured her with a smile that seemed practiced rather than spontaneous. Temporary acceleration, he called it. One rain-polished evening, Arabella stood before a mirror adjusting the silk sleeve of a deep blue gown, the night she would receive the Halcyon Prize for Humanitarian Design. The recognition mattered not because of prestige but because the pediatric campus had already begun transforming recovery outcomes. Sebastian had promised to attend. He knew how much this meant. His message arrived 20 minutes before the ceremony. Urgent Zurich negotiation. Cannot be delayed. Proud of you. Arabella read it twice, neither angry nor tearful, simply still. She accepted the award hours later beneath warm applause, her speech composed, her gratitude sincere. Cameras captured her luminous calm. None recorded the fleeting pause as she stepped away from the podium into solitude. Afterward, Dr. Lillian Price studied her with the clinical perception that made her an exceptional physician. "You are surrounded," Lillian said gently, "but you don't look accompanied." Arabella dismissed the concern with practiced optimism. Marriage required elasticity, she insisted. Seasons of intensity passed. Yet that night, returning alone to Ashcroft Hall, she felt the architecture of her life shift by a nearly imperceptible degree, like a structure settling after distant tremors. Sebastian returned the following afternoon carrying apologies wrapped in fatigue. He listened attentively as she described the ceremony, asked thoughtful questions, and presented a first-edition design folio he had tracked down through a rare books dealer. The gesture was impeccable. Still, Something about his embrace felt fractionally delayed. Winter advanced, and with it Arabella's quiet certainty that she no longer wished to postpone motherhood. She spoke of it not impulsively but with the deliberation she applied to every life decision. A child, she believed, would root them not only to legacy but to shared vulnerability, something beyond achievement. Sebastian did not refuse. He reasoned. Market transitions. Pending mergers. Structural volatility. Always soon, never now. Each explanation sounded rational in isolation. Together they formed a corridor leading endlessly forward. Arabella, who designed spaces to guide people toward comfort, began to sense she was being gently guided away from something instead. Meanwhile, Camille's presence expanded beyond boardrooms. She developed an ease inside Sebastian's orbit that others hesitated to name, finishing his analytical threads mid-sentence, anticipating strategic pivots, sharing private humor born from intellectual symmetry. Success intoxicates, but shared success binds. Julian noticed first. During a small shooting weekend on the northern grounds, he observed how Sebastian's attention recalibrated when Camille spoke, how silence between them felt less like absence and more like communication. Julian trusted observation over assumption, yet unease settled heavily enough that he nearly raised the subject with Arabella, nearly, but not quite. Loyalty can hesitate when certainty is incomplete. Arabella herself did not suspect betrayal. Her intuition moved more subtly. She sensed displacement without evidence, like warmth gradually leaving a room. One afternoon inside the nearly completed children's hospice, she walked the curved corridor as winter sunlight poured gently through elevated glass. The building felt alive, exactly as she had imagined. Families would find refuge here. Fear would soften here. Yet standing in that sanctuary, an unexpected realization surfaced. She was devoting her genius to constructing emotional safety for strangers while her own marriage had grown strangely formal, its spontaneity replaced by scheduling. Elsewhere, far from the hospice's quiet grace, Sebastian and Camille concluded a negotiation that would double the firm's valuation. Celebration followed, a private dinner chosen for discretion rather than glamour. Conversation drifted from projections to personal histories, from ambition to the cost of sustaining it. Camille spoke, perhaps for the first time, about exhaustion, not physical, but existential, the fatigue of forever standing near the center without belonging to it. Sebastian understood belonging primarily as control. When their hands brushed across the table, neither withdrew immediately. No declaration passed between them. None was needed. Some thresholds are crossed in silence long before action confirms them. The first undeniable lie formed weeks later, quiet as falling snow. Sebastian cited an emergency strategy session the same evening Arabella hosted trustees reviewing her next humanitarian project, a network of trauma recovery clinics. She believed him without interrogation. Trust had always been their native language. While she guided philanthropists through scale models and funding frameworks, Sebastian sat across from Camille in a secluded restaurant where city light fractured against rain-slick glass. What began as professional debrief unraveled into confession, about pressure, isolation, the strange loneliness that success often concealed. Camille did not console, she matched his candor with her own. When he finally returned home, the estate slept. Arabella had left a lamp glowing low in the library, a habit born from affection rather than need. Sebastian paused at the doorway longer than necessary, aware, perhaps for the first time, that deception altered not only facts but atmosphere. Upstairs, Arabella stirred briefly as he entered their room, murmuring a soft greeting before sleep reclaimed her. He watched her for a moment, expression unreadable even to himself. Outside, wind moved through ancient trees with a sound like distant surf. And somewhere within the vast steadiness of Ashcroft Hall, the first real fracture, invisible, silent, irreversible, spread another inch. Understood. I will now continue the story seamlessly into the middle arc, where tension tightens, consequences emerge, and the title event begins to cast its long shadow. No headings. No repetition. No contradictions. No flashbacks. Pure cinematic continuation. By early spring, Arabella's schedule had become a careful balance between expansion and restraint. Her newest initiative, a network of trauma recovery clinics designed for survivors of catastrophic injury, had drawn international attention. Invitations arrived daily, yet she declined most of them, preferring substance over visibility. Those closest to her noticed a subtle change. She moved with the same composure, spoke with the same warmth, but there was now a reflective distance in her eyes, as though part of her attention had turned inward. It was Dr. Lillian Price who first insisted Arabella undergo a comprehensive medical evaluation. The suggestion came gently after Arabella admitted to persistent fatigue she could not attribute to work alone. Reluctant but pragmatic, Arabella agreed. The diagnosis did not frighten her. It surprised her. A rare cardiac condition, manageable, the specialists assured, particularly when monitored early. With lifestyle adjustments and scheduled oversight, she could expect stability. Arabella received the news with characteristic calm, even curiosity, asking precise questions about long-term architectural commitments and travel tolerances. Sebastian's reaction, however, appeared deeper than concern. He became attentive in ways that almost echoed their early marriage, arranging private consultations, restructuring portions of her calendar, insisting she delegate more aggressively. To outside observers, it looked like devotion sharpening under threat. Yet Lillian, trained to read the dissonance between behavior and emotion, sensed something unsettled beneath his care. His questions focused heavily on timelines, probabilities, contingencies, forecast language. Arabella noticed none of it. What she did notice was how fragile life could pivot without warning. The realization did not weaken her. It clarified her priorities. More than ever, she wanted a child, not someday, but within the rhythm of the life she still fully possessed. Sebastian listened. He did not agree. Instead, he introduced delay wrapped in medical caution, citing stress thresholds and physiological prudence. His reasoning sounded protective, yet it nudged the future further away once again. Meanwhile, Camille's proximity to him had crossed from professional inevitability into personal territory so gradually that neither could identify the exact moment it transformed. Their dinners were no longer rare. Their conversations slipped easily beyond market strategy into philosophy, memory, even the architecture of desire, what people believed they deserved versus what they allowed themselves to claim. Camille never asked Sebastian to betray his marriage. She simply created a space where he did not have to mention it. The boundary fell one quiet night after an investor summit ran late. Rain sealed the city in reflective darkness, taxes scarce, the hour too advanced for pretense. When Sebastian suggested she wait out the storm in the penthouse apartment he occasionally used between early meetings, practicality framed the decision. What followed was neither impulsive nor theatrical. It was deliberate. Afterward, neither spoke of consequences. Their silence functioned as agreement. This would remain contained, controlled, untouched by the rest of their lives. But secrets rarely stay proportionate. Julian's suspicions hardened into near certainty weeks later during a charity polo event. He observed the near-invisible signals, the shared glances calibrated to avoid notice, the gravitational pull drawing them subtly closer within crowded spaces. He approached Sebastian privately that evening, his tone measured rather than accusatory. "Be careful," Julian said. "Some lines erase more than they promise." Sebastian dismissed the warning with polished ease. Speculation, he implied, often reflected the observer more than reality. Julian did not argue. Yet from that night forward, he watched with the patience of someone waiting for truth to surface on its own. Arabella, meanwhile, entered what should have been one of the most triumphant seasons of her life. Government leaders approved the trauma clinic network. Funding surpassed projections. Families wrote letters describing how her earlier pediatric campus had transformed experiences they once feared. She should have felt invincible. Instead, a quiet intuition continued pressing at the edges of her awareness, not suspicion exactly, but displacement, like music drifting faintly from a distant room. The decisive shift began with something almost trivial. A bank notification. Arabella rarely monitored household accounts personally. Financial infrastructure had long been consolidated under Sebastian's oversight for efficiency. Yet while reviewing documents for a philanthropic endowment she intended to establish, she noticed several substantial transfers routed through a secondary investment channel unfamiliar to her. She did not confront Sebastian immediately. Precision governed her instincts. She preferred understanding before reaction. So she made an appointment with Edmund Carlyle, the family's private banker, a man whose discretion had become nearly mythic within elite financial circles. Carlyle welcomed her with courteous neutrality inside a quiet office paneled in dark walnut. When she referenced the transfers, something flickered, quickly suppressed, but visible enough for a woman trained to read structural tension. "There appears to be no cause for concern," he said carefully. "Merely strategic reallocations." The phrasing unsettled her more than the information itself. Strategic for whom? That evening, she raised the subject with Sebastian, her tone curious rather than accusatory. He explained smoothly, liquidity positioning ahead of a major acquisition, temporary routing, standard practice at their scale. His answer aligned logically. Yet logic, Arabella was beginning to understand, could conceal as effectively as it clarified. Summer arrived carrying warmth that softened even Ashcroft Hall's austere edges. Arabella hosted a garden benefit for the trauma clinics, lantern lights scattered across lawns, a string quartet threading music through twilight. Observing her move among guests, Julian felt a tightening in his chest. She radiated a sincerity that made deception around her feel almost profane. Sebastian attended, attentive and publicly affectionate. Camille did not. The absence was intentional, discretion becoming operational discipline. Later that night, after the final guests departed, Arabella stood barefoot on cooled grass, speaking quietly about the future. She described a smaller coastal residence she hoped they might one day keep, somewhere defined less by lineage and more by chosen memory. Sebastian agreed readily, yet his thoughts seemed fractionally elsewhere, already calculating demands awaiting morning. 2 weeks later, Arabella collapsed. There was no dramatic warning, only a sudden stillness as her body yielded to a rhythm it could not sustain. The emergency unfolded with terrifying efficiency, ambulance lights fracturing dusk, Lillian's voice steady yet urgent, machines translating biology into fragile sound. Sebastian arrived at the hospital carrying a composure so absolute it appeared almost unnatural. 412 suspended hours, prognosis fluctuated inside guarded language. Then the monitors stilled. Lady Arabella Ashcroft was pronounced dead just before dawn, the horizon barely beginning to pale. Shock moved through London's professional and philanthropic communities with rare unanimity. Tributes described brilliance, compassion, irreplaceable vision. Newspapers struggled to compress the scale of her influence into columns. At Ashcroft Hall, silence deepened into something architectural, a presence occupying every corridor she had once warmed. Sebastian accepted condolences with restrained gravity. Observers praised his strength, unaware that grief expresses itself in forms too complex for public interpretation. Camille sent flowers accompanied by a message perfectly calibrated, respectful, distant, unimpeachable. The funeral drew statesmen, artists, families whose children had healed inside buildings Arabella imagined into existence. Rain fell softly, as though rehearsed. Sebastian stood beside the casket, Julian a step behind, Penelope supported by Lillian as quiet devastation tremored through her composure. When the final prayers ended and mourners dispersed beneath dark umbrellas, a different current began forming, invisible but accelerating. Within days, Sebastian and Camille met privately for the first time since the death. Their conversation avoided overt anticipation, yet relief threaded beneath their restraint. The future, once complicated by secrecy, appeared suddenly simplified. Arabella's estate was vast. Her personal accounts alone suggested extraordinary liquidity. All that remained was administrative confirmation. A week later, seated across from Edmund Carlyle inside the same walnut-paneled office, Sebastian felt a confidence bordering on inevitability. Camille sat beside him, outwardly solemn, inwardly poised for the life she had long imagined stepping into. Carlyle reviewed several documents before folding his hands. "There is a matter requiring clarification," he said. Sebastian waited, faint impatience surfacing. Carlyle slid a sealed file across the desk. When opened, its contents rearranged the very geometry of the room. Nearly every major asset, personal accounts, development royalties, controlling philanthropic endowments, and several discrete international holdings, had been transferred months earlier into an irrevocable financial structure. One Sebastian did not control. Primary beneficiary, a foundation already operational under strict legal protections. Secondary conditional authority, Dr. Lillian Price. Sebastian's name appeared nowhere. For the first time in years, his expression emptied of calculation. Camille leaned forward, certain a procedural error had occurred. Carlyle met their disbelief without flinching. Lady Ashcroft was exceptionally thorough, he said quietly. These arrangements cannot be contested without triggering further provisions. Outside, the city continued its indifferent motion. Inside that office, the future Sebastian believed secured dissolved with silent precision. And somewhere beneath the shock, a far more unsettling question began to surface, not merely how Arabella had foreseen this, but what else she might have known. For several seconds after Edmund Carlyle finished speaking, no one in the office moved. Even the muted city noise beyond the reinforced glass seemed to retreat, as though the world itself were allowing the revelation to settle undisturbed. Sebastian read the document again, slower this time, searching for ambiguity, a misplaced clause, a conditional loophole, anything suggesting interpretation rather than finality. There was none. Arabella's signature appeared steady and unmistakable across every page, witnessed, notarized, reinforced by legal architecture so meticulous it bordered on prophetic. Camille recovered first, her analytical instincts pushing past shock. She asked about spousal challenge, about inheritance statutes, about grounds for contesting capacity. Carlyle answered each question with the same calm precision. The structure had been executed while Arabella was in excellent cognitive health, reviewed by independent counsel, and protected by layered jurisdictions designed specifically to resist interference. The wealth Sebastian had assumed would naturally consolidate under his authority had already migrated beyond reach months before her death. More unsettling still was the timeline. These transfers occurred well before her medical diagnosis. This had not been the reflex of a frightened patient. It had been strategy. They left the bank without speaking. Outside, sunlight glanced sharply off passing cars, the ordinary rhythm of pedestrians continuing in oblivious contrast to the implosion unfolding within Sebastian's thoughts. Control had always been his native environment. Unpredictability belonged to weaker operators. Yet Arabella, whom he had quietly categorized as emotionally guided rather than strategically driven, had constructed an outcome he had never anticipated. Camille finally broke the silence once they were inside the car, her voice low but taut with calculation. People don't fortify assets like that without expectation of conflict. Sebastian did not answer immediately. A memory pressed forward, Arabella asking about unfamiliar transfers, her gaze thoughtful rather than suspicious. Had that been the moment she confirmed what she needed to know? The possibility unsettled him more than the financial loss itself. It suggested she had been observing while he believed himself unobserved. At Ashcroft Hall, condolences still arrived daily, yet the house no longer felt merely quiet, it felt watchful. Margaret Ellington, the family solicitor, requested a formal reading of Arabella's testamentary directives to clarify governance of the foundation now holding the majority of her estate. The gathering took place in the long library, afternoon light striping the floor between towering shelves. Penelope sat with composed fragility, Julian beside her, while Lillian remained characteristically still, not grieving less, but containing it with disciplined strength. When Margaret outlined Arabella's intentions, a pattern emerged that no one could dismiss as impulsive philanthropy. The foundation was charged with funding trauma hospitals, architectural research, and housing initiatives across underserved regions, its charter emphasizing permanence over prestige. Lillian's role, described as ethical steward, granted her oversight authority should operational integrity ever be threatened. Sebastian listened without interruption, yet an unfamiliar sensation threaded through him, displacement inside his own home. He had always considered himself architect of the Ashcroft future. Now he occupied it more as participant than author. Later that evening, Julian approached him privately on the terrace where dusk blurred the horizon into violet. She wasn't protecting money, Julian said carefully. She was protecting intention. Sebastian replied with cool restraint that intentions often required pragmatic management, something foundations occasionally lacked. Julian studied him, recognizing the familiar cadence of justification, but chose not to argue. Instead, he asked a quieter question. When had Arabella arranged all this? The answer surfaced the next morning through Margaret, who delivered a sealed letter Arabella had instructed be opened only after the bank disclosures were complete. Its contents were brief yet disarming. Arabella wrote that foresight was not distrust but responsibility, that structures, whether buildings or legacies, must be designed to withstand pressures unseen at their creation. She expressed hope that those she loved would understand the difference. There was no accusation, no bitterness, only the unmistakable voice of a woman who had anticipated resistance and built beyond it. Sebastian folded the letter slowly, struck less by its implications than by its composure. She had acted without confrontation, without spectacle, as though certain revelation would speak louder than any argument. Camille, meanwhile, refused to accept a future diminished by a single legal maneuver. She commissioned discreet reviews through contacts versed in inheritance litigation, searching for fractures within Arabella's fortress. Each inquiry returned the same conclusion: challenge would be ruinously public and almost certainly futile. Frustration sharpened into resolve. If wealth was no longer immediately transferable, influence might still be, through board positions, advisory leverage, reputational framing. She urged Sebastian to consider proximity rather than opposition. Foundations required leadership, after all. Yet Sebastian found his attention drifting elsewhere, drawn repeatedly to the question Carlyle's timeline had ignited. What exactly had Arabella perceived? The answer began emerging unexpectedly through Thomas Hale, who mentioned seeing her meet with Margaret several times the previous autumn, always returning from those conversations with a reflective calm rather than distress. Not the behavior of someone reacting, the posture of someone preparing. Sorting through Arabella's studio days later, Sebastian discovered her final architectural folio resting atop the drafting table, edges aligned with characteristic precision. Inside were plans for a coastal rehabilitation campus unlike anything she had previously attempted. Expansive, luminous, designed around the philosophy that recovery required not only medicine but dignity. Tucked between the drawings lay another envelope, this one addressed simply, "For whoever carries this work forward." He hesitated before opening it, an emotion close to reverence tempering his curiosity. Arabella wrote that buildings endure longer than grief, and that the measure of love was continuation rather than possession. She entrusted the project to the foundation, urging collaboration rather than control. Reading it, Sebastian felt an unfamiliar constriction, not quite remorse, not quite admiration, but something unsettled enough to resist naming. For the first time, he confronted the possibility that Arabella's understanding of him had been deeper than his understanding of her. Beyond the estate, whispers had begun circulating through financial circles. Some admired the elegance of Arabella's foresight, others speculated about motives. Camille perceived the reputational shift immediately, narratives forming in rooms where she once dictated them. Determined to reassert influence, she arranged a meeting with Lillian under the pretense of offering strategic guidance to the foundation. The encounter unfolded in a minimalist office overlooking the river, light reflecting sharply off the water below. Lillian listened without interruption as Camille described opportunities for accelerated growth, partnerships, visibility. When she finished, Lillian replied with gentle clarity that the foundation would expand deliberately, never at the cost of its ethical spine. Camille recognized dismissal wrapped in courtesy. As she stood to leave, Lillian added one final observation: Arabella believed structures reveal character over time. So do people. The remark lingered long after Camille exited, its meaning less accusation than quiet warning. Weeks passed, and with them the first subtle reorientation of power. Invitations that once flowed automatically towards Sebastian now arrived with measured neutrality. Collaborators wanted reassurance about governance, about direction. He adapted outwardly, projecting steadiness, yet internally he navigated terrain for which control offered limited leverage, legacy shaped by someone else's design. One evening, alone on the terrace, he reread Arabella's letter until twilight erased the lines. It occurred to him then that what unsettled him most was not the lost wealth, but the realization that she had anticipated a future in which her voice must speak without her presence. She had not trusted circumstance to honor her intentions. She had engineered certainty. Inside the house, Penelope began spending more time in the gardens Arabella once favored, finding solace in the cyclical reassurance of growth. Julian joined the Foundation's advisory council, less from obligation than conviction. Even Thomas moved with renewed purpose, tending the grounds as though continuity itself were tribute. And Sebastian, long accustomed to acquiring, found himself instead confronted with inheritance of a different kind: the responsibility of deciding whether he would resist Arabella's architecture or learn, belatedly, to inhabit it. Yet the most unsettling development arrived quietly, almost easily overlooked. Reviewing foundation armboarding materials, Margaret discovered an additional provision scheduled for activation on the first anniversary of Arabella's death, a disclosure clause referencing documentation held in escrow. Its contents were unspecified, its release mandatory. When Margaret informed Sebastian, he felt that same rare absence of calculation return, like air thinning before a storm. Arabella, it seemed, had one more structure waiting to reveal itself. And for the first time since the bank revelation, Sebastian understood a truth impossible to negotiate. The future was no longer reacting to his design. He was stepping into hers. That's all for today. Like, subscribe, and see you in the next episode. Stay tuned.